Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes over $38 trillion. Japan, $9 trillion. The European Union, $14 trillion. China, the country everyone pictures as the world's great lender, is itself drowning in borrowed money. Saudi Arabia, Germany, every single one. Add it all up. Every sovereign debt on the planet, every government bond ever issued, every IOU, every treasury ever signed. $315 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Let that number sit for a second. $315 trillion. If you spend $1 million every single day since the dinosaurs went extinct, you still wouldn't have spent that much money. So here's the question that should stop you cold. If every country on Earth is in debt, who is actually owed the money? Somebody is sitting on the other end of those $315 trillion. Somebody signed the other side of every one of those IOUs. Somebody is the creditor. Who are they? Where are they? And why? In all the years you've watched the news, read the headlines, heard politicians argue about debt ceilings and deficit spending, why has nobody ever told you their name? That question sounds simple. The answer is one of the strangest things you will ever hear about how the modern world actually works. And by the end of this video, the way you think about your taxes, your savings, your rent, and the price of everything around you, it will have permanently shifted. I'm going to give you that answer. But to get there, we have to burn down a few things you think you already know. The obvious answers and why they're all wrong. Most people, when they hear the words national debt, think one word immediately: China. Makes sense. China is America's great rival. China has been buying American government bonds for decades. The whole America is in debt to China story has been repeated so many times on cable news and political speeches at dinner tables that it feels like established fact, like something everyone just knows. Here's what's actually true. China holds around $800 billion of US government debt. $800 billion. That sounds enormous, until you realize it's approximately 2% of the total. 2%. If a friend owed you money, a lot of money, and you held 2% of the debt, you would not be the creditor. You would be a footnote. China is a creditor. China is not the creditor. Those are very different things, and the fact that almost nobody makes that distinction tells you something important about how financial stories get told. So, if not China, who? Maybe it's old money. The dynasties, the families whose names float around whenever someone starts asking who really controls things, the ones who've been quietly accumulating capital for centuries, collecting interest while the rest of us work. It's a compelling image. It taps into something that feels true about how the world works. It's also mathematically impossible. The combined net worth of every ultra-wealthy dynasty in recorded history doesn't come within $100 trillion of $315 trillion. Private wealth, however concentrated, cannot explain a number that size. Something else entirely is going on. The banks then? Goldman Sachs? JP Morgan? HSBC? Deutsche Bank? Surely the global banking system, the institutions that are always somehow involved in every financial crisis, that always seem to come out intact when everyone else is bleeding, surely they are the ones collecting on all this sovereign debt. Banks do hold significant portions of government debt. That part is true. But banks also borrow. Banks issue their own bonds. Banks owe money to pension funds, to insurance companies, to central banks, to other banks. Any given financial institution is simultaneously a creditor and a debtor within the same system. Pointing at Goldman Sachs and calling it the creditor is like watching a poker game, pointing at one player and declaring them the winner, without noticing that everyone at the table borrowed their chips from everyone else before the game started. None of the obvious answers work. That's not a coincidence. Follow the money. Here's what's actually happening. Follow the money. Not as a metaphor, but literally. One step at a time. Watch where it goes. Imagine 3 friends. Give them names. Japan, America, and Europe. Japan lends money to America. America lends money to Europe. Europe lends money to the developing world. And the developing world takes the earnings from its exports, converts them into savings, and parks those savings back into American government bonds, lending right back to America. The same money moves in a circle. Nobody actually pays anyone back. They just keep passing the same IOU around the table, adding a little interest each time it changes hands. Now take that image and scale it to $315 trillion. That is the global financial system. Not a pyramid with a shadowy creditor sitting at the top. A loop. A closed circle of promises, spinning endlessly, never arriving at a destination. The debt doesn't move toward zero. It moves in orbit. Let's make it concrete. Japan is the largest single foreign holder of U.S. Treasury bonds, roughly $1 trillion worth of American government debt sitting in Japanese hands. Japan lends to America. But where did Japan get that $1 trillion? Japan runs massive trade surpluses. It sells far more to the world than it buys. Cars, electronics, machinery. Those export earnings accumulate as foreign currency reserves, And those reserves need somewhere safe to live. You can't just leave $1 trillion in a current account. And U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment on Earth. So Japan buys them. America, through its contributions to the International Monetary Fund, lends to countries in financial distress. When Greece was on the edge of collapse in 2010, American money, channeled through the IMF, was part of the rescue package. America lends to Europe. Europe, through the World Bank and a network of bilateral agreements, lends to developing nations. Infrastructure loans to African governments. Development financing across Southeast Asia. Credit lines to countries in Latin America trying to build roads, power grids, water systems. Europe lends to the developing world. And developing nations, as they grow and accumulate foreign currency reserves from their own exports, look for somewhere safe to park that money, somewhere stable, somewhere liquid. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds. The circle closes. Every country holds someone else's IOU. Every promise is secured by another promise. Nobody at any point in the chain actually expects to be repaid in full. Not now, not ever. The debt just keeps rolling over. Old loans replaced by new ones, endlessly. It's a subscription that nobody can cancel, because canceling it would collapse the entire arrangement that everyone inside it depends on. Once you see the loop clearly, once you really see it, the original question starts to dissolve. The creditor isn't a person, it's not a country. It's not a family, or a bank, or an institution with a name and an address. The creditor is the system itself. And the system isn't held together by anyone's wealth. It's held together by something far more fragile than that. The thing it runs on. Every government bond in existence is a promise. A piece of paper, or more accurately these days, a digital entry in a database, that says, we will pay you back with interest at a specified future date. The reason that promise has value is not because the government has the money sitting in a vault somewhere waiting for you. It doesn't. The reason it has value is because enough people believe it will be honored. That's it. That's the entire foundation. Investors buy U.S. Treasury bonds not because they think America will one day sit down and pay off $38 trillion of debt. Nobody believes that. Nobody expects it. Investors buy Treasury bonds because they believe that America will keep making its interest payments, keep rolling over its principal when bonds mature, keep the machine running indefinitely. The deal on the table isn't repayment. The deal is continuity. As long as everyone keeps believing in the continuity, the numbers can stretch in any direction. The global financial system runs on a collective agreement to keep agreeing. It runs on coordinated faith. And before you dismiss that as cynical or conspiratorial, that's not a fringe reading of how this works. That is the openly acknowledged, documented mainstream design of modern sovereign finance. Central bankers know it. Finance ministers know it. The IMF knows it. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan is to keep enough of the world believing that it will be for long enough that it doesn't matter. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about systems built entirely on belief. They work perfectly, right up until the moment they don't. And when they break, the consequences don't distribute evenly. When the abstraction ends, in Athens, in 2010, there was a woman named Maria, 62 years old, 30 years as a civil servant, working in municipal administration, showing up every day, doing the unglamorous work that keeps a city functioning. She had paid into the Greek pension system her entire working life, done everything she was supposed to do, everything the system asked of her. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't expecting luxury. She was expecting the pension she had been promised, the one she had literally worked 30 years to earn. That year, the Greek government's debt became unsustainable. The interest rate on Greek bonds, the rate Greece had to pay to borrow new money, spiked so sharply so fast that within months, normal borrowing became functionally impossible. The country was effectively locked out of the markets that sovereign governments depend on to function. The IMF arrived. The European Central Bank arrived. The creditors who had been invisible for years, the ones whose money had been flowing through the loop the whole time, suddenly had very visible faces, very specific addresses, and very precise demands. Austerity, public sector wage cuts, tax increases, and pension reductions. Maria's pension was cut 3 times in 4 years. By 2015, she was living on 40% of what she had been promised when she started working in 1980. She had not borrowed recklessly. She had not made the decisions that caused the crisis. Those decisions were made in Athens and Brussels and Frankfurt and Washington. She had no seat at any of those tables. But the weight of the system's failure landed in her kitchen, in her bank account, in the gap between what she needed to survive and what she now received. That is how the abstraction ends. The loop of IOUs, the circle of rolled over promises, the elegant architecture of collective belief. When it breaks, it doesn't shatter in trading rooms. It materializes in someone's ordinary life, in the space between what they were promised and what they now have. Argentina has gone through this 9 times. 9 sovereign defaults. 9 times the same pattern has played out. Borrowing becomes unsustainable, the invisible creditors materialize, negotiations happen in rooms that ordinary Argentines will never enter. New terms are imposed, and the cost falls on people who had the least to do with the decisions that created the crisis. In Buenos Aires, in December 2001, the government froze bank accounts overnight, without warning. Families woke up to news that the savings they had worked years to accumulate were simply inaccessible. They stood outside banks that wouldn't open their doors, holding passbooks that represented money they could not touch. One family, the Garcias, had spent 15 years saving to buy a small apartment. Their account was frozen in December. When partial access was restored in January, the peso had been devalued so severely that the savings they had accumulated over a decade and a half could now buy a fraction of what they had planned. The creditor had been abstract the whole time.
The loss was entirely concrete. Sri Lanka, 2022.
The country ran out of foreign currency reserves entirely. Not a financial crisis in the technical sense, a physical one. It could not pay for fuel imports. Petrol stations ran dry across the island. Hospitals lost power. A doctor at a hospital in Colombo described performing surgery by the light of mobile phones. Nurses standing around the operating table holding their phones steady over the patient because the hospital generator had run out of diesel and there was nothing left to run it on. The government collapsed. The IMF arrived with a bailout and a list of conditions. And the people who had been quietly on the other end of every deal, every bond, every loan, every rolled over obligation, made themselves known. They had an address in Washington, and every dollar of relief came with requirements attached. When belief breaks, that's what happens. The system that had been running silently in the background, it materializes. It shows up with a briefcase and a list of things you need to change about your country before the money arrives. Where you fit. Let me tell you where you fit in this, not theoretically, specifically. That tax return you filed this year, a slice of every dollar you sent to your government, didn't go to roads or schools or hospitals or any of the things you picture when you think about where taxes go. It went to servicing debt, paying interest on bonds that were issued years, sometimes decades, before you started working. In the United States right now, interest payments on the national debt exceed the entire defense budget. You are paying interest every single year on decisions made before you were born to bondholders you will never meet, for debt that will never be fully repaid in your lifetime or your children's lifetime or your grandchildren's. That is not an accident of history. That is the architecture. Now think about your retirement savings, your pension, your insurance policy. The institutions managing that money, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, are legally required to hold what regulators classify as safe assets. And the definition of safe in the current global financial system is government bonds, which means your retirement money is, in meaningful part, a loan to your own government. You are the creditor. You are also the taxpayer servicing the debt. You are on both sides of the transaction simultaneously, funding the debt and being owed the debt, paying the interest and receiving the interest. And the net result of all that circular movement is that the institutions sitting in the middle collect fees on every single step of the journey. The last time you felt financially squeezed, rent going up faster than your salary, groceries more expensive every month, the strange sensation of working harder while somehow falling further behind. That squeeze has a structural explanation that goes considerably deeper than bad luck or poor personal choices. The system quietly extracting from one side of your ledger is the same system you are quietly invested in on the other side. Most people never see both sides at once. The design depends on that. The cracks in the foundation. Here's where this stops being history and starts being the present moment. The system, this entire architecture of circular debt, collective belief, and perpetually rolling obligations, is under more pressure right now than at any point in the last 50 years. Not because of any single dramatic crisis, because of a slow accumulation of fractures that the mainstream financial press consistently underreports. The first crack appeared when interest rates rose. For most of the decade after 2008, debt was extraordinarily cheap. Near zero interest rates made rolling it over almost painless. Governments could borrow almost for free, replace old loans with new ones at minimal cost, keep the subscription running without strain. Then, between 2022 and 2024, rates rose sharply. The most aggressive tightening cycle in 40 years. Governments that borrowed heavily at low rates are now refinancing at dramatically higher ones. The subscription is getting more expensive. And unlike a streaming service, unlike anything else in your life, you cannot cancel. The payments continue, whether you believe in what you're receiving or not. The second crack is geographic. Countries across the global south have watched the IMF impose conditions on their economies for decades, conditions that consistently, in crisis after crisis, in country after country, benefit creditors over debtors. That pattern has not gone unnoticed. A growing number of those countries are now quietly building alternatives. Trade settled in currencies other than the US dollar. bilateral lending arrangements that bypass Western institutions entirely, the slow, deliberate construction of a parallel financial architecture that doesn't depend on the same collective belief system. It's incomplete, it's early, but the direction is unmistakable to anyone watching the right data instead of the right headlines. The third crack is the most fundamental. The entire system depends on two pillars holding steady. The first is the unquestioned dominance of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. The second is the unquestioned reliability of American institutions. The belief that American promises will be kept regardless of who is in office. Both of those pillars are being tested simultaneously right now, not with a single dramatic blow, persistently, quietly, in the finance ministries and trading rooms of countries that spent decades accepting the arrangement without question, and are now, for the first time in generations, genuinely questioning it. Remember Maria in Athens, living on 40% of a pension she spent 30 years earning. Remember the Garcias standing outside a Buenos Aires bank in December, watching 15 years of savings become unreachable overnight. Remember the doctor in Colombo holding a phone over an operating table because the generator had run out of diesel. None of them chose the system that failed them. None of them had a seat in the room where the decisions were made. None of them were consulted when the terms changed. The creditor was always the system. The system was always held together by belief. And belief is not a fixed quantity. It is not stable or guaranteed or permanent. It moves. It concentrates in some places and slowly, quietly drains out of others. And when it drains from the wrong place at the wrong time, $315 trillion stops being an abstraction. It becomes a line outside a bank, a pension cut in half, a surgery performed by the light of mobile phones. The question that matters. The loop is still running. The circle of debt is still moving right now as you watch this. But the people who understand this architecture, the ones who built it, who manage it, and who have the most to gain from its continuation, they are not resting on the assumption that it will run forever. They are already preparing for a world in which the current arrangement cannot continue indefinitely. They are already working in the same rooms that ordinary people are never invited into on what comes next, on the shape of the system that will replace this one, on who it will be designed to serve. The real question, the one that actually matters, the one the financial press almost never asks, isn't who the creditor is. We've answered that. The creditor is the system. The system runs on belief. The real question is, when the current arrangement finally shifts, who will the next system be built to serve? Not Maria, not the Garcias, not the doctor in Colombo, probably not you. But that math can change. It changes when enough people understand the architecture clearly enough to demand something different from it. It changes when the conversation stops being about deficits and debt ceilings and starts being about who the system is actually designed to protect. That's why this channel exists. Subscribe to Historic Finance, because the next chapter, the one about what comes after this system, is already being written. And the only question is whether you're reading it or just living with the consequences. The next video starts now.